Europeans were standing on the edge of the world, gazing across oceans and deserts, asking themselves a question that would change a continent forever. Who truly controls the future of Africa? By the late 19th century, Africa was a land of mystery. A continent rich in resources and possibilities, yet fragmented by dozens of kingdoms, empires, and tribal confederations. From the deserts of the Sahara to the jungles of the Congo, Africa held wealth beyond imagination: gold, ivory, diamonds, rubber, and fertile lands that could feed millions. And Europe wanted it. But how did a handful of nations, separated by rivalries and distance, manage to carve up the entire continent in just a few decades? And at what cost? In this video, we are going to explore the story of the Scramble for Africa, why it happened, how it happened, who it affected, and why the consequences are still felt today. So let's start. The story begins in the mid-19th century, when European powers were already looking beyond their borders for trade and influence. The Industrial Revolution had transformed European economies, creating an insatiable hunger for raw materials, new markets, and investment opportunities. Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, Italy, and even Spain were on a quest for expansion. Africa, with its vast natural wealth and untapped human potential, became the prize. But Africa was not an empty land. It was inhabited by millions, organized into sophisticated kingdoms, empires, and societies with their own laws, trade networks, and political hierarchies. Europeans, however, often ignored these realities. Maps of the continent were filled with blank spaces, marked as terra incognita, unknown land waiting to be claimed, as if the people who lived there did not exist. The first wave of European involvement was primarily economic and missionary-driven. Christian missionaries traveled deep into the interior to spread their faith and European culture. Traders and explorers, often backed by their governments, sought ivory, rubber, and gold. Figures like David Livingstone became legends for their daring explorations, but they also paved the way for political and military intrusion. These early expeditions created maps, gathered intelligence, and established trade outposts, setting the stage for more aggressive action. By the 1880s, competition among European powers had intensified. Germany, a newly unified state under Bismarck, wanted to assert itself on the global stage. France sought to recover prestige after its defeat in the Franco-Prussian War. Britain wanted to secure routes to India and consolidate territories in southern and eastern Africa. Belgium, under King Leopold II, pursued personal control over the Congo, claiming it as a private enterprise. And Portugal and Italy looked to maintain or expand what they already held. No one wanted to be left behind. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 became the pivotal moment in the scramble for Africa. Organized by Otto von Bismarck, it was ostensibly meant to prevent war among European powers over African territory. But the reality was far more cynical. African leaders were not invited. No African voices were present. The conference produced a set of rules for claiming territory. Powers had to notify others and establish effective occupation, meaning they had to actually control the land, not just claim it on a map. What this created was a mad dash for African soil. Military forces, expeditions, and treaties with local rulers, sometimes voluntary, sometimes coerced, allowed Europeans to declare possession almost overnight. The methods varied. In North Africa, France and Britain moved into Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, and Sudan, often using gunboats, armies, and strategic alliances with local elites. In West Africa, the French pushed along the Senegal and Niger rivers, while the British consolidated coastal territories and began moving inland. Central Africa became the domain of King Leopold II's Congo Free State, where exploitation reached horrific levels. Forced labor, violence, and the extraction of rubber and ivory caused millions of deaths. Southern Africa witnessed a brutal contest between Britain, the Boer settlers, and local kingdoms like the Zulu under Shaka's descendants. The Anglo-Zulu War and the Boer Wars exemplified the extremes of European military power and African resistance. Economic motives were inseparable from political ones. Industrial Europe required raw materials for factories: cotton, palm oil, rubber, minerals, and Africa provided them in abundance. Simultaneously, colonies were seen as markets for manufactured goods. Imperialists argued that controlling territory meant controlling trade, taxation, and labor. But there was also a growing sense of ideology, the so-called civilizing mission. Social Darwinism, racial theories, and missionary zeal intertwined to create a narrative that European control was not just desirable but necessary. It was framed as a moral obligation to bring order, Christianity, and modernity to backward societies, masking the brutal exploitation underneath. Resistance existed, but it was fragmented. Some African states tried to fight, like the Ashanti in modern Ghana, the Sokoto Caliphate in Nigeria, and the Mahdists in Sudan, but European armies, armed with rifles, artillery, and machine guns, often prevailed. Treaties were signed, frequently under duress. Leaders were coerced into concessions that were interpreted as full European sovereignty. The maps of Africa, once full of kingdoms, chiefdoms, and empires, were redrawn in a matter of decades, with borders that made little sense in relation to ethnic, linguistic, and cultural realities. These borders would later sow conflict that persists to this day. King Leopold's Congo is a case study in the worst excesses. While Belgium claimed to administer it, it was effectively a personal fiefdom. Villages were forced to meet impossible rubber quotas. Failure meant mutilation or death. Reports of atrocities eventually reached Europe, creating public outrage and forcing Leopold to cede control to the Belgian state. Yet by then, millions had suffered, and the pattern of exploitation and extraction had been established across the continent. At the same time, imperial powers competed against each other openly. The Fashoda incident of 1898, for example, brought Britain and France to the brink of war in Sudan over a small outpost. Diplomacy, threats, and rapid troop movements often decided ownership before any African participation. Germany, frustrated with its limited colonial acquisitions, became an ardent supporter of aggressive policy, even though its African territories were smaller. Italy too sought to expand but faced fierce resistance in places like Ethiopia, which successfully defeated Italian forces at Adwa in 1896. Proving that African armies could still defend sovereignty under exceptional leadership and circumstances. Beyond the military and political dimensions, the scramble for Africa transformed economies and societies. Traditional trade networks collapsed. Local rulers were co-opted, exiled, or executed. Cash crops replaced subsistence farming, and forced labor was common. Infrastructure, railroads, ports, and telegraph lines was built primarily to extract resources and consolidate control, rather than to benefit local populations. Education systems, where they existed, were designed to produce clerks and administrators for the colonial machinery. Entire cultures were subordinated to European priorities. The impact on global geopolitics was profound. Africa became a pawn in European rivalries. Colonies were leveraged for trade, prestige, and military advantage. The continent provided soldiers for European wars, raw materials for European industry, and markets for European goods. The scramble also cemented the notion of imperialism as a normal, legitimate policy. Rivalry over Africa foreshadowed the alliances and tensions that would later erupt into the First World War. By the early 20th century, almost the entire continent was under European control, except for Liberia and Ethiopia. The speed and scope of the scramble were unprecedented in human history. In less than 40 years, Africa had been mapped, claimed, and reorganized for the benefit of distant powers. Local populations had little say. Sovereign kingdoms that had existed for centuries were dismantled. Africa's integration into the global economy came not as an equal participant but as a supplier of raw materials and cheap labor. The consequences of the scramble for Africa were immediate, profound, and long-lasting. European powers had drawn borders on maps without regard for the people who lived there. Ethnic groups, languages, and cultures were divided across multiple colonies, while rival groups were forced together under foreign administration. These arbitrary borders became a source of tension that would erupt repeatedly in the 20th and 21st centuries. The seeds of conflict were planted during the scramble itself, when colonial powers used a divide-and-rule strategy, empowering certain groups over others to maintain control, often creating hierarchies based on loyalty to the colonizers rather than local legitimacy. Economically, Africa's integration into the global system served European interests almost exclusively. Extractive industries dominated, with gold mines in South Africa, copper in Zambia, cocoa in West Africa, and rubber in the Congo producing enormous wealth for European investors. Local populations were subjected to forced labor, low wages, and high taxes, creating conditions of exploitation that stifled local entrepreneurship. Agriculture shifted from subsistence to cash crops, leaving communities vulnerable to price fluctuations in European markets. Infrastructure such as railways, ports, and telegraph lines was built to facilitate extraction rather than local development, laying the foundation for uneven economic growth that persisted long after independence. Socially and culturally, the impact was equally significant. Missionary activity, colonial education, and European legal systems transformed African societies in complex ways. Christianity spread widely, often replacing indigenous religions and social structures. European languages, education models, and governance practices were imposed, creating a generation of Africans who were literate in colonial languages but disconnected from traditional systems. While some Africans benefited from access to education, military service, or administrative roles, the majority were excluded from meaningful participation in governance or economic decision-making. These social changes created new elites, often loyal to the colonial power while eroding traditional authority. Resistance was a constant undercurrent during the colonial period. Many African societies attempted to fight back through armed conflict, negotiation, or passive resistance. Leaders such as Samori Toure in West Africa, Menelik II in Ethiopia, and the Zulu kings in southern Africa demonstrated the persistence and resilience of African societies. Ethiopia's victory over Italian forces at the Battle of Adwa in 1896 was a symbolic and practical triumph, showing that well-organized African states could resist European conquest. Nevertheless, these successes were exceptions in a broader pattern of subjugation and domination. The Scramble for Africa also transformed European politics and international relations. Colonies became instruments of prestige and power. National pride became intertwined with imperial holdings, leading to diplomatic tensions and occasional crises. The Fashoda incident in Sudan exemplified how minor territorial disputes in Africa could bring European powers to the brink of war. Competition for African territories contributed to the complex web of alliances, rivalries, and tensions that ultimately fueled the outbreak of World War I. In essence, the Scramble for Africa was not just about the continent itself, it was a catalyst in the broader dynamics of global power. World War I marked the first major disruption of colonial rule, as African soldiers were conscripted to fight in Europe and local economies were redirected to support the war effort. The post-war period saw shifts in governance, with mandates in former German colonies and the League of Nations assigning territories to new colonial powers. Yet African voices remained largely excluded from these decisions, reinforcing patterns of external control and political marginalization. This period also saw the emergence of early nationalist movements, as educated Africans began to question the legitimacy of foreign domination and to imagine self-determination. The interwar years witnessed both consolidation and contestation of colonial authority. European powers invested in infrastructure, resource extraction, and administrative systems, but they faced recurring resistance and unrest. Economic shocks, including the Great Depression, revealed the vulnerability of African economies dependent on global markets controlled by distant powers. Social and cultural changes accelerated, with urbanization, missionary education, and the spread of European legal systems creating new social hierarchies and challenges to traditional authority. These dynamics laid the groundwork for the nationalist movements that would sweep Africa in the mid-20th century. World War II further accelerated changes in Africa. African soldiers fought for European powers, gaining military experience, exposure to new political ideas, and a heightened sense of global awareness. The war weakened European economies, undermined the legitimacy of colonial powers, and created opportunities for African leaders to press for independence. By the late 1940s and 1950s, the decolonization process had begun in earnest. Ghana became the first sub-Saharan African country to gain independence in 1957, followed by dozens of others over the next 2 decades. The process was uneven, marked by negotiation, rebellion, and in some cases, protracted conflict, such as in Algeria, Angola, and Kenya. The legacies of the Scramble for Africa continue to shape the continent today. Arbitrary borders, ethnic divisions, and unequal economic development contribute to political instability, civil conflict, and ongoing challenges in governance. Resource wealth, initially exploited for European benefit, remains a double-edged sword, often fueling corruption, conflict, and international competition. Yet the period also introduced new forms of infrastructure, education, and political organization, which African societies adapted and transformed in the pursuit of independence and development. The global consequences were equally profound. The Scramble for Africa exemplified the dynamics of imperialism and the ways in which powerful nations project control over distant territories. It reshaped the global economy, linking Africa's resources to European industrial growth and international markets. It also set precedents for the modern nation-state system in Africa, with colonial administrative practices influencing contemporary governance, legal frameworks, and diplomacy. Moreover, the moral and ideological debates surrounding colonization, exploitation, and resistance reverberate in global discussions about human rights, justice, and historical accountability. Culturally, the Scramble left a complex legacy. European languages, education systems, and religious practices became deeply embedded, creating both opportunities and tensions. African societies negotiated these influences, blending them with indigenous traditions to create hybrid identities and cultural resilience. Literature, music, art, and political thought from post-colonial Africa reflect this interplay between external imposition and internal adaptation, highlighting the enduring capacity of African societies to shape their own destiny despite historical disruption. As the 20th century progressed, Africa's role in the world shifted from being primarily a supplier of raw materials to a continent asserting political, economic, and cultural agency. International organizations, regional blocs, and African-led institutions sought to address the structural inequalities inherited from the colonial period. The Organization of African Unity, now the African Union, symbolized the continent's effort to reclaim autonomy and craft a collective identity after a century of foreign domination. Yet global powers continue to exert influence, demonstrating that the geopolitical significance of Africa, first recognized during the Scramble, remains undiminished. Looking back, the Scramble for Africa stands as one of the most dramatic transformations in modern history. It was a period of ambition, exploitation, resistance, and adaptation, involving millions of people, vast resources, and unprecedented international rivalry. It reshaped the map, altered societies, and set the stage for both the modern African state system and the post-colonial challenges that continue to define the continent. The Scramble was not merely a story of conquest. It was a story of power, economy, ideology, and human resilience. It demonstrates how distant decisions made by European capitals could determine the lives, futures, and identities of millions across thousands of miles of territory. In conclusion, the Scramble for Africa was a defining moment not only for the continent, but for the world. It marked the height of European imperial ambition, the global integration of economies, and the profound disruption of indigenous societies. The legacies of this era, political borders, social hierarchies, economic patterns, and cultural transformations continue to influence Africa and the broader world. Understanding the Scramble for Africa is essential to understanding modern history, the roots of contemporary conflicts, and the forces that shape the modern global order. It is a story of ambition, cruelty, resilience, and transformation, a chapter of history whose effects remain visible in every corner of the continent today, reminding us that the past is never truly gone. It continues to shape the present and the future.